from Brazil, from Canada, and another one also from Canada. So fantastic presenters talking to us today about labor, algorithms, and industry. So just over some ground rules again. So if you've got questions, please save them to the best of your ability. When the presentations are over, then just, put the raise your hand, use the raise your hand feature. Or if you're not able to do that, then just put as Michael was saying, just put the question in the chat box. So that would be very helpful at the end. So in the interest of time, we should begin now. So each presenter will have 15 minutes. That's 15 minutes each. So it will be one presentation after the other, and then the final one. So we've got 4. And what we will do is just to time manage, when you've got 5 minutes left, you'll hear my voice over your voice. So apologies to the presenters. You hear my voice. I'm going to say 5 minutes. Then I'm going to warn you at about, let's say 2 minutes, 1 minute, and then time's up. So hopefully we don't get there, but yeah, just in the interest of time, yeah. So our first presenter will be Ángel Eduardo Ruiz from the University of Guadalajara, and he will be presenting on the impact of Industry 4.0 in Mexico on labor matters and social security. So Eduardo, the floor is yours. So do share your screen.
Thank you
And
very
once you
much.
start, I'm going to start timing you, yeah?
Thank you very much, Umar, and thank you very much for all the organizations. I'm not sure about the protocol, but I would like to speak freely about this matter on the automation on my university behalf. Of course, when we speak about laboral matters in Mexico, we tend to speak very different from what well, I will say it like that. We are in Mexico and Latin America used to very different matters in labor matters than the rest of the world. In my experience as a researcher on behalf of my university, I've been searching and I've been investigating most about automation in the last 3 years. And this is the most important part of my work because those 3 years are going to set up the whole investigation that we are going through. And about the impact of Industry 4.0 in Mexico on labor matters and social security, this is what I've been looking for. This is what we have been finding out about automation and the impact on the workers and employers in Mexico, especially in Jalisco. I'm sorry about my English. I'm a little nervous, but this is kind of or part of the participation of World Congress, and trying to explain myself in English. It's not something that we are used to. In Mexico, we do not speak very often in English, but I'm very glad to have the opportunity to explain my point of view about this global issue about automation and the impact, I insist, on Mexican labor market. Um, First of all, let me explain what I do. I'm a lawyer in Mexico. I have clients that belong to industry, like many of you have heard about tequila industry and about the education industry, which I am very familiar with. So the first thing that I have found out is that in any international speech that I try to participate, I like to explain the difference between work and employment, because all across Latin America, I include Colombia, Argentina, even Brazil, we have this variety in the whole world, for example, about employers, employees, and workers, who many of us could be professional or freelancers or on demand. And these two kinds of occupations that both are economic activities made by individuals who are exposed to risk and retirement, they have very different impact about the new technologies and automation in Mexico. In the last 3 years, we have been discovering that agriculture and occupation, like difficult tasks, are more often to be replaced with machines than with many more workers. So in that matter of ideas, the type of occupations that are factible of automate are about the main figures in our investigation at the University of Guadalajara, which are those professions who eventually are going to disappear because of the automation of stuffs or the smart things that we can do, or even because it's easier to do it with machines or artificial intelligence that with the collective humans or with the traditional human handwork. So about this, the occupations that are going to get slower or disappear at all will be phone operators or bank managers, or even waiters are starting to disappear in some ideas, not as the rate or as fast as other countries that I've been with, but the fact that these machines are going to disappear so many jobs, it's part of my research about the impact of this kind of industry in the modern occupation. So everybody wants technology. Everybody, it's used to getting with the smart of things, with the algorithms that help us to do our jobs faster and better. No one is arguing that the technology is bad. But we are often seeing more in Jalisco, like this coboting or the co-working with robotic stuff and softwares that trying to help us to do better jobs and more efficient jobs. And in this matter of ideas, for using the whole range of my time, I would like to show this map about Mexico and the occupation and the high probability of automation that lacks in the whole country. Mexico, it's right now above the United States, and I'm sorry, yes, above the United States, on the south of the United States. And as we can see here, the more percentage of high probability of automation is in the south, because the more probabilities and the more industries are going to the south with the inversions of our current politics or current politic in the government. The south is the highest probability of automation because the handwork is required over there, but no one wants to do this in the traditional manner of the handwork. So this is a whole investigation that had discovered many things, such as, for example, here in Jalisco, where I'm putting my mouse, where you could share it, but you could see it, sorry. Jalisco is the main producer of tequila worldwide. It is a liquor beverage that it's economically significant in the economy of Mexico, such as vodka or whiskey to other countries. And the probability of automation and employee losses in that industry alone is going to be directly proportional to the technology that we can rely on the next 10 years for the tequila plants to grow or to fully grow in order to become the main ingredients of the hot beverage. We are having, I'm sorry? Oh, we're having up to 10 years of growth in that industry alone. So when we put this automation on behalf of that industry, we definitely can see an impact on the next 10 years of almost 50% of the losses of the job of the persons who are agriculture irrelevant due to the technology like GPS self-driving tractors or drones that could just look out of the plants for over the next 10 years and record everything, and one person can do it. So those persons who are required to take care of the plants for 10 years for that industry alone will be replaced basically by 50% in the next 10 years due to automation alone. And in my second participate, so I do not abuse of my time and I would like to participate more in this Congress, I would finish my participation. Oh no, I'm sorry. I thought that I had uh, made my time, but no.
You have about 6 minutes left, Edoardo.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Umar. I'm just a little nervous because my English, I don't know if I'm very familiar with, but let me go through. So I've been explaining about this tequila industry and the impact alone in that matter. Why I do this? I'm a lawyer in the University of Guadalajara. Guadalajara is the main capital of the state of Jalisco. And Jalisco, among another two or three states, are the only ones who can legally produce tequila. No other part of the world can do that. So if you drink tequila from China, let's say, or other part of the world, you're not drinking that. So I'm doing this. I personally don't like tequila, but or endorsing that. But it's an important and huge industry, at least in my state. And the impact on automation is going to represent the more or the more profit to the liquor factories, but they're not going to redistribute that to the social matters that the employer or industry itself could do. Because the whole process of thousands of liters of the beverage could be do it or could be done with a handful of workers or employers. So the profits of the industry against the social loss with employers or not or employees losses or workplaces replaced by machinery or automation itself, it is very concerned to the public because a region, an entirely region depends on that. And the thing that they're not redistributing this, not even with social security or taxes alone, is, well, a social highlight for us. Because in social security matters in Mexico, well, every time I do speak internationally about Mexico, I'm a little afraid of being very rude about it because our politics and our institutions of social protection are very deficient. And this is very difficult to admit for most of our authorities. But right now, we have crisis among jobs losing due to the COVID-19 pandemic and stuff like that, like any other country. But the fact that we are not having a specific plan of economic development for the future, or that not even with automation, the authorities are trying to do something about this work or job loss emergency that we are doing. It's concerning. It apparently that it appears that our government is not based on any plan to recover the jobs that are lost or the any of the social security losses that are going to suffer. We don't have an unemployment insurance like in the United States or Canada, which now with the United States and Canada Mexico agreement is going to be very interesting that the government address these issues and say that they cannot do it, they cannot comply as good as it appears that the United States or Canada do. It's very difficult for me because I am a lawyer that tries to do or tries to see the positive way about many things, but in this matter, just for example, about automation as a fact that we can do, but we do not implement it, is that our main Supreme Courts and courts and federal courts just stopped working. And just recently, like 15 days ago, um, after maybe 3 months of being shut down completely, just reopened online. We could do this years ago. I mean, like in the United States and in Canada, we have a way to use the technologies and try to, well, at least unleash justice online. However, this is mainly impossible for many of us, like the way, or many Mexicans who doesn't only have a lack of internet connection, but a lack of a smartphone or a lack or a computer. It's very sad that we can, or we are facing the future, but we cannot share it with our most wealthy countries and fellow um, partnerships around the world. And
Time,
this is my first 15 minutes,
time is
Umar.
almost up,
Thank you very much.
Edoardo, so if you can wrap up.
No, that's okay. I actually want to take more questions if they are asked, but I would like to finish this. This is my first participation, right, Umar?
Yes.
Excellent. No, so that's it.
Well, thank you so much then, Eduardo, for a presentation that definitely requires more attention, and hopefully we'll get more Q&A as we keep going. So our second presenter is Julie Garneau from Université de Laval, and she will now hopefully be able to share her screen, unmute herself, and start presenting. And again, Julie, at about 5 minutes, I'll signal to you.
Yes, okay. So can you see now the presentation on the screen?
Yes, we can, Julie.
Okay, so I'll go. So thank you for this opportunity to speak to many colleagues that are interested in digitalization and Industry 4.0. My presentation is in both languages, mainly in French, but I'll be speaking in English now that I see that the participants, just to be fair. So if you have any questions, then I can take them either in French or in English afterwards. Okay, so let's start. Come on. Okay, so here's my plan. So I'll be talking to you about one concept, which is the Industry 4.0. And then I'm gonna show you how this concept can be translated by parties or by actors, local actors, in many different ways. I had planned to give you examples of Denmark and Quebec. And unfortunately, with the time that I have, I'll be focusing on Denmark. And also because of COVID, I had to stop some field work in Quebec. So I'd rather speak about Denmark for today. And then it's going to show you that, you know, Industry 4.0 is implemented differently. And I'll be using the concept of institutional experimentation as a way to translate what Industry 4.0 means for management and labor parties in different workplaces. So we all hear about, you know, those new technologies about interconnected data, Internet of Things, big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence. I won't spend a lot of time on these, just to say that these new scientific technologies are really changing the way work is produced, and especially in the manufacturing sector, we come now with this idea of a new and a future smart factory, which is called often Industry 4.0. So really what I want to say today, I guess the main concept or the main idea about Industry 4.0 that I'd like you to take away from my presentation is that it's a constructed political project. It's all about technology, but really it really becomes critical for country leaders to relocate production. We call it the onshoring of manufacturing. So Industry 4.0 is now used as the vehicle to get a hold of the manufacturing sector for countries. And it's a new model that it's proposed, and it's based on personalized and tailor-made production. And manufacturers are turning to new technologies to minimize production costs and to integrate the production and the value chain. It's going too fast. And just to tell you a bit about how this concept means many things. When we talk about Industry 4.0 to managers or to union leaders, they talk to you about, oh, it's a buzzword, it's business as usual, or some of them are talking about it's a life or death issue. Either you embark in this transition or else you die as a company. But in between these two extremes, you get to understand that this is still a project for cost reduction, and it's for shrinking time and space in the different business models. So it's still a product. It's still part of the production model that we're in. So this within that context, what we are saying is that this opens up a space for institutional experimentation. The fact that this context, this issue about Industry 4.0 is undefined, and also it brings uncertainties because no one really knows exactly how to handle this. So actors, local actors, are faced with this undetermined situation, and they're using institutional experimentation as a way to resolve a situation. And they're doing that by using their institutions that are surrounding them in very unusual way. We call it a bricolage, or it's a recombining of institutions. It can also be the creation of new institutions to really settle a specific issue. And what is important is that it's done by trials and errors. So that's a bit the concept in a nutshell. If you're interested in that concept, you can read further through these references. So I've applied that concept to my case studies that I've been conducting for my doctoral thesis. And today I'm going to talk to you about the one that I've done in Denmark, as I said, and I call it ILERA2020 because it's a company, it's a manufacturing company in the aerospace sector. And I've conducted some interviews for the last 3 years. And I've also used documents like the corporate documents that are very helpful to understand how parties were strategizing to deal with that issue. Some participant observation and visits, plant visits. And the objective of this research project is to better understand the process of institutional experimentation. So I went deeply into the sub-processes, and also with a focus to understanding the institutional enablers. Because as part also of this theory behind institutional experimentation is that it can lead to good results or to bad results, better work or worst work. So I guess the institutional setting is really important, and this will, I guess, feed into the discussion with Edoardo, what you were talking about, how institutions matter in that context. So really how it starts like a puzzle, really. So it's an industrial puzzle where if you go back to 2008, there was a need felt by manufacturing companies that they really needed to rethink the way the manufacturing sector was working in Denmark at the time. And they really needed to improve their competitiveness. Okay? So, and they needed new knowledge. And when you talk to managers, what they're saying is that at that time, they felt they didn't have the right tools to embark into that transition. They didn't have the capacity, the internal capacity. And in my case, it was a case of automating. They wanted to automate a production line where they were changing from steel to fiber composite, carbon fiber composite. And it is a very fragile material. They needed something very flexible. They needed a robot that was quite different from the robots that they were used to for steel. So they didn't know how to do it. They turned to universities, and it was felt at the time that universities were not doing research that was useful for companies. So they needed to join, and that was the start of this experimentation. Okay, so I'll go quickly into the timeline. Okay, so it started, as I said, in 2008. So it started with a really a very informal grouping. It's the manager of the company that met with his former colleagues from other industrial companies, and with one or two university professors. They were discussing, chatting about the fact that they felt that they needed to do different research to meet the needs of the company. And it started like that. And then they started to say, well, you know what, we need to really refocus our manufacturing sector in Denmark. And then they used here a more formalized way of defining the problem through a European initiative. It was called Manufacturing 2025. So that initiative, coming from the Euro countries, they used that as a form of collaboration to rethink the whole industrial sector of Denmark. And they came up with a report. And in that report, they suggested that there was a mental shift in how they had to see manufacturing in Denmark. They had to shift from a production of goods to a production of knowledge. So they see if we are to embark in this digital world, we have to shift the way we do our manufacturing business. And from that, they decided to create MADE in 2014. MADE stands for Manufacturing Academy of Denmark. So really what it is, it's a new research center comprised of all the universities in Denmark that are studying engineering. So with the different types of engineering, they also bringing SMEs, they also bringing employers association, big companies, and they say, okay, how can we create the knowledge? How can we create applied research that will help the future of our industries?
5 minutes left.
How many?
5.
Oh, okay. So really, it's just to show that this experimentation is a process of new combination, of new coalition of actors who are trying to resolve the issue of Industry 4.0. And this is just a process that I'm trying to show that how it works. Really, it starts with new habits that you need to do things differently, and then you have to define the problem. You have also to think about how solutions can be defined, and then you do it with experimental actions. And then, of course, you see all those under-processed here, sub-processes, that deliberation, coalition, recombination of different institutions. You have creation of new institutions. You have trials because you use everything around you to try out something. And persuasion, you have to convince people also to get into your project. And then you have to use some resources. So the institutional resources that were available for actors in Denmark were large. So there was a lot of resources available to actors, and also unique capacities. That's, of course, we know that from different literatures, how you want to change things, you need some framing capacities. But also the enabling conditions. The enabling conditions in Denmark were there really to help parties to really resolve or try to resolve an issue of Industry 4.0. And that with these institutional enablers, they were able to really get to that robot, because I didn't get to the end of the story, but they're really far advanced in finding a solution to automate that production line. And here you have a lot of enabling conditions that are supporting actors in their experimentation. So potential takeaways, I guess, for the discussion today, I think it's interesting is that we see that the Industry 4.0 concept, it's still underdefined. And of course, you see there's some battles around the definition of it. You have the engineering section, you have political actors, you also have workers that should have a say, because it's all about it's a political project. So actors must be able to get a voice in the definition of the what is it and what are the impacts. So we have also to think that Industry 4.0 is not a natural phenomenon. It's not just a deterministic approach to technology. You have actors that are there, and the actors, they need resources, they need capacities, capabilities, and there's some institutional work involved into that definition. And of course, the context matter. So here in my case, there was the enabling conditions with a lot of governance, a strong governance, architecture for participation. And there were also a state providing security that helped actors to be able to experiment and find a solution. And just to say here, it's just a table showing that, you know, the experimentation is down here as a regulation is down below. But it has to be seen in the context of a broader contextual and institutional settings. And because some workers lost their job out of this automation, but they were really, they were not left behind, because the system was able to take care of these workers and to retrain them. So really the context matters, and experimentation can be one way to regulate work and the definition of Industry 4.0, but you have to be mindful that you need a broader context to support and to secure that experimentation. So I'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie, for finishing on time as well. So our third presenter will be Petersen from Memorial University of Newfoundland in Canada. So Bui, if you're still online, you got to stop sharing, I think, Julie.
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry.
So Bui can then share.
Okay, find the right window here.
Great.
And you have to maximize that. Okay,
Yep.
let me just move this one window to the side here somehow. There we go. That's perfect.
Thanks. And Bui,
sorry,
again, 5 minutes before your time, I'll nudge you or something, yeah?
Yeah, thanks. Okay, thanks you, and thank you for the previous presenters who provided a nice introduction for me, so I don't need to talk so much about the Industry 4.0. Is the theme of you know, what's going to change into jobs and what is automation going to do to jobs. That's what I want about. And it's an old problem which I don't need to go into, but you know, a nice picture of the Luddites from the early 19th century where they're, don't want to go into that. So this is an old discussion, and it resurfaces many times. Like every time there's a new technology and so forth, a new development, like Industry 4.0, people were just mentioning, and discussion is there anything different this time? And some people say there is, and provide the kind of dystopian predictions of the impact on the number of jobs. But there are other people have predicted, well, the net effect is not going to be that great. However, what most people seem to agree on is that there's going to be impact on jobs, and we have already seen impact on jobs. We have over time seen impact on jobs. So our interest with this paper is to see, well, jobs will be impacted, but what will the impact be on various populations or population segments of society? So to do that, we use an intersectional approach. So just for anyone who doesn't know what that is or not familiar with it, Kimberly Crenshaw talks about in terms of class, the relationship between class and race, no, gender and race. And this concept has been expanded to include many other categories such as class, disability, and so forth. Basically, it means that people might be disenfranchised in society for a number of reasons. It could be for gender, it could be for race, it could be for class, it could be for disability, but this approach highlights the intersections of these things. So meaning basically, if you are black, you could be black man or a black woman. That's a different experience. You could be a white woman or a colored woman, or you could be a woman who's an upper economic class or lower economic class. These are all different experiences that have different social outcomes. And we're looking at what these intersections, what the effects they have on what we refer to as automatability. So the likelihood of that a particular job becomes replaced with computer technology. And we are proposing that education is a key explanatory variable in this relationship, and we base this on what Otter and colleagues refer to as the routinization hypothesis, which is that computer capital will substitute tasks that follow explicit rules. So these are manual tasks that follow a routine, routinized jobs basically. Versus computer capital will complement jobs that are more complex, that involve sort of complex communications and problem solving, and so those jobs may enhance. They will less likely to be replaced. So we have some formal hypotheses to test that we're testing in this study. And basically, first we're looking at the categories of education requirement of occupation, the pay level of the occupation, the relative gender representation of the occupation, whether it's male-dominated or female-dominated, and the representation of visible minorities. And we are predicting particular relationships with some are likely to be automated based on these characteristics, or less likely to be automated. Basically, education the education relationship is based on the routinization hypothesis, because these jobs that are high in the complex skills and the communication skills are often associated with they often require a higher level of education. Also, the more routinized, the more manual jobs are typically lower pay. So they are the more manual, so that means the higher pay is going to be associated, we expect it more associated with a lower risk of being automated. Gender representation. So men are often more working in manual routine jobs than women. Women often end up in care type of jobs, which are more complex in a way. They might be low pay, but they're more complex. And so we're actually predicting that male-dominated jobs are more likely to be automated. And visible minorities are often disenfranchised in terms of their access to jobs. And we are predicting that on the net level, they're going to be associated with higher likelihood of being automated. as we in the prior slides showed, we are predicting that mediation is going to be a key intervening variable explaining this relationship. However, as the idea of not all males are the same. Some are visible minorities, some are white. Not all visible minorities are there. Some are male, some are female, some are high income, in high income jobs, or some in low income jobs. We are predicting there are going to be different effects depending on these intersecting variables. So our methods is that we used the Canadian census for 2016. We focus on our unit of analysis is the National Occupation Code occupations. So our cases are not individuals in the study. These are actually, each occupation is one case in our statistical analysis, which we have like 493 different occupations. We use as variables, we use this is the Maniaca, is the McKinsey Institute report that is predicting which jobs are going to be most affected or are most likely have the ability to be automated using today's technology, using a task analysis approach. And this kind of predictions have been translated by Lam and colleagues to fit the Canadian occupation codes. We computed a education variable based on the percentages of occupations, percentages of various education levels for each occupations, and we created a scale from 1 to 6. Depending, 1 is the lowest level of education, so you have not even finished high school, and 6 is that you have completed some university education. Gender representation, just percentages within each occupations. Same for visible minority representation, and the pay level we normalized to from 0 to 1. So everything is related to 1 is the highest average annual income for a particular occupation. We used a mediation moderation analysis using the process macro developed by Hayes. So our results. We find that if you look at the bottom line, automatability, all the variables are either significantly correlated with automatability. As we predicted, gender representation and visible minority representation are positively correlated. It means that these are more likely to be automated, and pay level and education requirement are negatively correlated. Note that the education requirement is by far the strongest correlation at minus 0.57. So now the second hypothesis was testing for the mediation. And as you see in this diagram is that the 3 independent variables, gender representation, pay level, and visible minority representation, are onto the left. And the education requirement is in the middle as the mediator, and our results show that the education requirement fully explains the relationship between gender representation and pay level to automatability, but it does not mediate visible minority representation in this figure. There's, as you see at the bottom, there's a direct relationship between visible minority representation and automatability, and there's only a direct relationship for visible minority representation. However, as we mentioned earlier, our third hypothesis is that this relation is going to vary depending on intersection of these different variables, which is our next slide. So this is basically the same slide with gender representation and pay level put on as moderators rather than independent variables.
5 minutes left, yeah, boy.
Thank you. So as you will see, there was no significant moderation for visible minority representation. That's the NS is 4. But you'll have to see the opposite effects for high pay occupations. There's actually a negative relationship between visible minority representation and automatability. That's the numbers in the parentheses here. It's a negative indirect effect. But there's a positive indirect effect for low income. For gender representation, I won't go into detail of the moderation on both sides, but the net effect is the one, the bold ones in the parentheses here, is that for high income occupation, there's a negative relationship between visible and minority representation and automatability, but for low income, there's a positive indirect relationship. So what does this mean? If you look at one of the occupations, if you look at closely what the occupations are. So in Canada, this is a Canadian sample, so we're not saying we're just going to generalize to all countries, but there might be that visible minority situation is different in Canada than in some other countries. But in Canada, which occupations are high pay? They're high pay and high pay level. No, they're high pay level and high male representation. Engineer is the one comes out on top. And that makes sense. That's a high education occupation that is very unlikely to be automated, right? In contrast, a dominant, if you look at an occupation that is sort of most predominant, sort of visible minority and female, and is low pay level, and sewing machine operators, and this is something that's predicted to be highly likely to be automated, or at least it's possible to do that. You know, the only factor is whether, well, if the labor is so cheap, then it might not be worthwhile automating it. That's the only sort of factor that might get in the way of that. So what can we say in summary of this is that educational requirement is a significant mediator, but the mediation for visible minorities is the contingent on pay and gender. So for example, low pay and female occupations, visible minority jobs are more likely to be automated. For high pay and male occupations, visible minority jobs are less likely to be automated. And educational requirement is only a partial explaining for visual minorities. So there's another explanation there which education doesn't account for. The thing is that when you do a sort of an interaction analysis, is that, you know, interaction go both ways. So while we didn't hypothesize, make a hypothesis with gender as an independent variable, we find that maleness is a stronger predictor for white occupations than for non-white occupations. But it's just, and it's a stronger predictor for high pay occupations, and I don't have time to go into the details of that. And there's a similar other interaction if you look at pay as the independent variable. So to summarize, the effect of patient, even if the net effect is limited, some populations are particularly at risk. Education is critical. First of all, high education occupation are less likely to be affected by automation, and which is why some visible minorities are less at risk because some of them are highly educated. But the other things that focus on higher education is that it makes people with higher education are better able or can more easily transition to a different occupation. And finally, that unexplained effect that is not mediated by education, are we talking about direct or systemic discriminations? So that's just a question mark we end with. So that's the end of my interpretation. It's just the end of a story. This study was actually supposed to include a regional or urban-rural factor, and we couldn't fit it in. There was too much. So I have a picture from the local Newfoundland instead. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Boodoo, for your presentation and being on time. So if you could stop sharing your screen such that Victor can then pop in and share his screen for his presentation.
Do you see my screen?
Yes, we do, Victor. And
Yes.
such a good well, you don't have to maximize, but
Okay.
5 minutes before the end of your time, I'll give you a nudge, yeah?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presence of everybody. I'm Victor da Silva. I'm a doctoral student at the University of São Paulo, specifically in the Faculty of Law, majoring in the area of labor law and social security law. This paper, Designing Collective Bargaining in the Gig Economy, Some Possible Contributions from Brazil. It is a paper that I wrote with my supervisor at the University of São Paulo, Professor Antônio Rodrigues de Freitas Jr. This is in fact based on another paper that we presented some weeks ago in the Law and Society Association annual LSA annual meeting. I think it was in I think 28 May 28, something like this. So it in fact is a work in progress, and I'm really happy to be here. If you want me to email our presentation and our paper, it will be a pleasure. Here we have the contacts, so feel free. So first of all, I would like to just talk about the paper contents. In fact, I will delve into the Brazilian experience, but the paper is richer than this because it tries to provide the person with a broader perspective in the economy and the changes in the world of work, and we talk about the case of the USA and some cases in Europe also that are relevant to our study. As a matter of introduction, I would like to say that, as Professor Edoardo said, in the Brazilian labor law, we have workers divided in two groups. We have the independent contractors and the employees. And the employment relationship in Brazil is based on 5 elements. We have to make this test to see if the person is an employer. So, legal subordination, work performed by a person; habitual work, work performed by someone specifically; and work that is paid. And the independent contractors in Brazil, they are almost ignored by the Brazilian labor law. So it's really important for us to understand these employment tests in Brazil. Some important news about the world of work in this gig economy era. Uber has launched in November 2019. Uber works with temporary staffing agencies, so this is an expression of an expansion in this area. LinkedIn and its competitors, there are some studies that try to understand if LinkedIn in the future may be considered, for example, an employment agency, so intermediating employers and job seekers who may in the future be reclassified as employees. So it's a problem maybe to be addressed in the future. In the current labor markets, they have increasing number of people in the gray areas of employment relationships. Some core ideas on trade unions. In our paper, we focus on international norms, especially in the norms of the International Labour Organization. So within the core ILO conventions, we have the number 87 on freedom of association and number 98 on collective bargaining. Brazil has ratified convention number 98, but not convention number 87, and we will see this in more details. Trade unions have protections in many other documents, such as 1919 ILO Constitution, 1944 Declaration of Philadelphia, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Decent Work Agenda, 2008 Social Justice Declaration, and the 2019 ILO Centenary Declaration. That's really recent. The importance of the protection is like, these protections try to provide some equalization of employers and workers' voices in their negotiations. So it's really important. some updates in the USA and Europe. I will not delve into these themes, but for example, we have in the USA the 2015 ordinance of the city of Seattle. We have the Independent Drivers Guide in New York, the Rideshare Drivers United in Los Angeles, informal organization of workers against Instacart. In Europe, we have GMB. In the UK, we have the trade unions of taxi drivers in Italy. We have the General Unions of Workers, UGT, that's really traditional in Spain. European Trade Union Confederation on decision of the Court of Justice of the European Union. So this theme of the trade unions in this gig economy era is like they are popping up. You know, sometimes workers organize in a highly informal way, and sometimes they try to have a support of the traditional trade unions, and sometimes form their own trade unions. In Brazil, we have to step back for a moment and consider our trade union system. We have the foundation of our trade union system is 1943. Look at the date, 1943 Consolidation of the Labor Laws, CLT. And CLT establishes the exclusiveness. Exclusiveness, unicidade in Portuguese, determines trade unions according to professional and economic sectors, categorias, as trade union, sindicato, refers to employees and employers, and in a territorial base, base territorial, not smaller than a municipality. So the rule of exclusiveness is really important for us to understand this, the trade union system in Brazil. And trade union, I highlight here, refers both to the organization of employees and the organization of employers in Brazil. Trade unions are private associations registered as so in the system of the Ministry of Economy and the Ministry of Justice and Public Security, more specifically in the National Record of Trade Union Entities. So they have to have this register to be considered trade unions. The registration, with the registration, the trade union can exercise collective bargaining and sign the results of the collective bargaining, the collective labor agreement, and the collective labor covenants. The workers in the trade unions are employees, excluding all the types of workers, for example, volunteers, interns, or casual work. So the classification litigation is really important for us to understand if a person can join a trade union in Brazil. And trade unions of independent contractors are considered of economic sector, employers, not of professional ones, employees. So look at the importance of the classification litigation in this theme. The corporatist roots. Well, we have to go back to Getúlio Vargas. Getúlio Vargas was a dictator in Brazil. He has the inspiration from the Italian fascists to impose his new state, Estado Novo, dictatorship, creating the CLT, the official trade unionism, against the anarchist trade unions that had existed, and the specialized labor justice. The corporatist incidence is about the 30s and the 40s in eroded Western liberal democracies. So we have examples of Spain, Argentina, and Portugal. The corporatist idea, perhaps the core of the corporatist idea, is the need of shift in the institutional center from the parliament, where the political parties are, to the professional/social chambers, where workers and employers associations are. And the rule of exclusiveness it's really interesting to highlight this also, is present in all Brazilian constitutions since the 1937 one, including the enforced 1988 Federal Constitution, that is a landmark, that is a milestone in our democracy, in the Brazilian democracy.
5 minutes left, Victor.
Okay. About the economic sector, we define this via the solidarity among the entrepreneurs of similar, identical, or related activities, and a company that performs more than one activity joins the sector referred to the main activity, example, construction. The professional sector, similarities of living conditions that a job in an economic activity offers, for example, metal workers. And other possibilities. We have two other possibilities: differentiated professional sectors, employees who have unique living conditions. An example here are the drivers, and the liberal professionals, independent contractors or employers with their professional council. And an example here are the lawyers that are linked to the Brazilian Bar Association. Nonetheless, the dichotomy independent contractor / employee remains, which reinforces the importance of the reclassification litigation. Here I present a table about highlighting these how this question of the trade unionism in Brazil is displayed. So here we have on the one hand we have the National Confederation of Land Transportations, that is a trade union of employers, and the National Confederation of Workers in Land Transportation, that is related to trade unionism of employees. Notes about trade unionism reform in Brazil. Many trade unions, they benefit from this cooperative system, as they do not have competition, which demands the mobilization of the stakeholders, federal government, judicial branch, perhaps having the ILO as a consultant. So it's a really complex thing. The 2017 labor reform in Brazil suppressed the compulsory aspect of the trade union contribution paid by employers and workers to fund their respective trade unions, and allowed the derogation of state norms by collectively negotiated ones, impacting the principle of the most favorable norm to the worker. Nonetheless, ILO Convention number 87 is still unratified by Brazil. Here presented also a table about two trade unions involving taxi drivers in the state of São Paulo and the city of São Paulo. We have Sinditaxi, that is a trade union of employers because they are self-employed taxi drivers, and we have Sintetaxi SP, that's a trade union of employees. And we have this very curious reality in Brazil. And when we talk about Uber in Brazil, we have to go to the federal revenue of Brazil and see the main activity of Uber. Here we have that the main activity of Uber is in the intermediation activities and agency of services and business in general, except real estate. So what we see here is that the trade union of Uber is the one representing employers in the economic sector, in the economic activity, intermediation activities, and agency of services and business in general, except real estate, not transportation, as you see. The trade union of Uber employees is the one representing the employees in the economic activity above, exception to the differentiated professional sectors. And Uber drivers, if they're classified as independent contractors, they will not be covered by the trade union of the Uber employees. Ride-hailing app drivers do not essentially differ from other drivers, which make specific trade unions unlikely. And some associations are wrongly referred in Brazil as trade unions, having the possibility to negotiate with Uber, but without the representation ega omnes of the professional sector or the prerogative to oblige Uber to take part in the negotiations. So as a matter of conclusion, we have the 1988 Federal Constitution guarantees both the rule of exclusiveness and the freedom of association. Classification litigation is fundamental to Uber drivers and other platform workers to create and join trade unions that can collective bargain with Uber and other platform companies. Informal collective organizations are a real possibility, which may put an increasing number of workers in these gray areas aside the formal labor system in Brazil. And the democracy in the workplace, we should remember this, may benefit not only shareholders, but also stakeholders. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Victor. And thank you so much to the other presenters as well for keeping on time. Any delays was actually because of me and introduction and everything. But yeah, thank you so much for great 4 presentations that we had on Industry 4.0 in different contexts, different ways of looking at things. So I think it was very helpful to have probably now opened the floor for some kind of discussion regarding, questions that some of you may have on these papers, the presenters, etc. So The way I would like to move forward is if you've got a question, I believe you've got the raise hand feature in Zoom. So if you could raise your hands, what that should do for me as well as for Michael, who is the technical facilitator, is it should put you on top of our participants list. So if you could just raise your hands for questions, that would be helpful. And then what I'll do is I'll ask you to unmute yourself, and essentially one at a time we'll be asking questions to all the presenters or to one presenter, or we'll see how it goes. But before we get to raising hands, there is a question here for Bui from Ushnish Sangupta, and or Ushnish, I guess is a he, but I'm not sure, asking whether there's any difference in the Canadian results versus results from global data. So Bui, unmute yourself.
Actually, I don't know. We had to check back with that report. I don't know if Ushnis remember what that report says, because I can't quite recall myself. But it's maybe something we should engage with.
Great. Any other questions from anyone with the
So
raise hand?
I know Ushnis wants to respond to my question, my answer.
Go ahead, Ushnish, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, to just very quickly, it's similar results that, and it was more focused on gender, and that part about visible minorities was not disaggregated as far as I remember. But it's just that, and more specifically about AI, not all kinds of automation, that AI resulted in fewer jobs for women based on income and so on and so on. So it was very similar, which is why I wanted to ask if there's any difference between what's being reported globally and the Canadian context. But maybe you can look at that report sometime when yeah.
I appreciate the suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any hands raised, Michael? Because I can't see anything at the moment.
There are no hands raised at the moment.
Yeah. I had a question, I guess, for Edoardo, maybe. So when you were, at some point you were talking in your conceptual understanding, it was about courts in Mexico and having very little legal protection for workers and so on. In light of what Victor was saying in Brazil, I was just, again, I don't know the Mexican landscape that much, but maybe you can clarify. What about unions and their political connections in Mexico? What's the, does that come into your understanding of the protection of workers? I just want to talk a little bit about this, the political landscape and the association or not of unions with political parties.
Well, unions and political parties, thank you, Umar, for the question. The unions and political parties are actually recently reformed law. They suffered a recent reform in 2019, 1st of May, day of work, Labor Day. And basically, the union trades must suffer a whole equation for demographics. So unions were historically very close to the politics, and our first political party was very often re-elected because of the unions. Right now, it's being rebuilt because unions, myself as a lawyer, I perceive by very specific industries that the free of unions is not true. Actually, I think that it's very restricted, and well, most of our union trade organizations offered protection contracts, collective bargains, but protection. And this is a whole issue that was trying to get solved by this reform in order to make more unions democratic and actually prevent discrimination of unions. Like if I belong to a union and starts to work in another company, there were statutes that said that unless I quit or belong to certain union, I wasn't able to get a job in that machinery in that industry. That still happens because we can, well, the reform of our federal law, it's recent, it's 1 year ago. And with COVID, well, it stopped completely. So we have the legal background, we have it in our law, but it's still an issue. So union trades and politics must suffer a conversion because most of them were protection collective bargains contracts in the whole industry. Actually, I can tell from public records that many politics have been fighting with big automated industries in Puebla and Tlaxcala, where the factories of cars in Mexico are, about well, the true freedom of unionize, both from workers or for another unions that want to actually contest with the unions for the collective bargaining agreement chance, you know. So I don't know, Umar, if that answered your question correctly.
Yeah, that was helpful. Just for the unknowledgeable one in the room.
With a little thing, with a little context that may be interested, I was contacted by the European Commission to get some questions to those both collective unions or union traders, and both from employers and employment. And well, when the time that I asked these surveys, well, they deny most of those accusations, right? Because publicly they cannot simply say that they are still doing collective bargains or protective collective bargains and simulating most of the cases the collective agreements. So when I ask those questions, well, they deny it. So it's like the two faces we see in Mexico. Of course, they do not discriminate, and of course, they do not even involve in the life of a union trade. I mean, the corporations. But at the bottom, more deeply, they do.
Great. Thank you so much for a elaborated answer, Edoardo. Really appreciate. Ushnish, was that the second question you had?
Yeah, for our Brazilian colleague, Victor. So, as you know, in California, there's legislation to turn the gig workers, drivers into employees. In Canada, though, there's a unionization drive, particularly for I think it was Foodora, and Foodora left the country. So the small markets or jurisdictions like Canada don't have the power like California to legislate these companies into accepting their workers as employees, right? So that's one question. What do small markets or jurisdictions like Canada do that don't have as much power like California and other jurisdictions? And the other question is a lot of talk about platform cooperatives, like the workers owning the, the cooperative that, but I just think it's impossible. The amount of capital required, the workers don't have it. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on platform cooperatives. So two questions, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your question, Professor Sengupta. Thank you very much. Nice to meet you. I understand your question. I think that, I don't know, but I think it's a phenomenon that historically occurs in Latin America. There is like a race to the bottom in this region of the world, So you like fostering regulations of work. And I think that the question of Foodora can be the question of Uber in the future, because if they are considered, if the Uber drivers, for example, are considered employees by constitutional amendment or a decision of the Supreme Court of Brazil, we can have, for example, Uber leaving Brazil. It's a reality and it's a danger. And I think that here in Brazil, we do not have these independence to be bold as, for example, the Californian regulations. And your second question, I don't know exactly what you are trying to. I don't know what. Could you repeat, please?
Sure. And so the one alternative that has been suggested is that the workers own the companies, and it has been called platform cooperative. But in my opinion, I think for the type of companies we're talking about, it's impossible. The capital required to set up a company like Uber or Lyft, and the workers do not have this capital to set up a company like this.
Yeah, I would say that this is bad, I think, for the business they will make, because the market itself, I think that will not see this process of workers owning companies as something positive. So the market can turn I don't know, can neglect this experience, you know, and this experience can fail because of this. So, but one of the strategies is like that I found. It's like framing Uber drivers as coop workers, so cooperatives, as they are a cooperative, in fact. I think it's an attempt. I think that we may have an obligation at this moment to think in other solutions outside the traditional categories that we have. So perhaps it's a possible construction.
Thank you so much, Victor and Ushnish, who thumbs up, as you can see there. Sean had a question that he wrote for Julie, but maybe Sean, you can unmute yourself and verbally relate the question on top of other things.
Yeah, I had a question for Julie, but I also had a comment on the Foodora case that was mentioned. Just a point of reflection. Yeah, Foodora left the country, right? But, you know, should that preclude us from introducing further regulations because companies will leave the country? My view, I just wanted to kind of bring up my view on this. If you look at Sweden, for example, they have very strong regulations in the form of sectoral bargaining, and companies leave all the time. There's no Walmart, there's no Amazon in Sweden, right? But there are other companies that take their place that behave more ethically and treat workers justice and comply with the social standards. So I just wanted to make the point of, you know, yeah, okay, Foodora may leave and some companies may leave, but do you guys actually think that this is a barrier to introducing stronger standards in industries, including, you know, including those relating to gig work? Or is that actually kind of maybe a positive benefit that we're actually filtering out more employers that play a more negative role in society? And then I'll just, I had a question for Julie after this, and I'll just read out what I wrote. It was just that Julie discussed Industry 4.0 in 2 countries. And I was just wondering if she noticed any critical differences in the attitudes of unions and workers in both countries towards new technologies. And if this related to power in any way emanating from the bargaining institutions.
Yeah, thanks, Sean, for your question. You're exactly right. There is a big difference in how unions and workers see the new technologies coming into workplaces. I was quite surprised, frankly, when I arrived there and I was, you know, doing my interviews, talking to union reps, how they were so positive in Denmark about this new technology. And it was kind of funny to hear how they had the same message, they had the same vision all the different union reps and also the employers reps, they were saying, well, technology is good for Denmark. Technology is good for us to improve our competitiveness. We are a small country. We're open to the global market, and we need to be very competitive to remain on the land. I mean, it's if we don't want to lose our business out to other countries, we have high salaries. We want to maintain that. There's no way we can go down with the salary levels. So we need to use the technology to improve productivity. So that was the message I got across. And then, of course, in Quebec, you get a bit of suspicious vision about how this technology will impact your work, how it will impact your job. Will it leave you behind? Will you, you know, and it was two different mindsets. And coming from North America, and you know, I was a bit skeptical about what I heard in Denmark all the time, because I said, well, there must be something that they're not telling me. And then doing some further investigation and talking to people and different professors there, to say the system is there to help out. The system is there to protect workers who are gonna lose jobs, because they will lose jobs because of automation and the new technology. So, and for them, it was not an issue because the system was there to retrain them, to support them. And of course, there are, you know, you have to be critical also about the fact that the state is also reducing, you know, the insurance system, employment insurance system. So you have to be also critical. It's not all rosy there. But then there's a vision there that you must embrace technology to be able to survive in this competitive world. And also because of the structure of consultation and the legitimacy of unions there. So they are really part of the definition of what this new digital world will do in workplaces. And just recently, they also had a big working group. They call it the Disruption Council. Just the name tells it that they know it's going to disrupt the world of work. But they said, okay, we'll have a big consultation group, and employer associations were there, unions associations were there, civil society, government, universities, and they did it for, they did a big consultation for 2 years. They just launched the report. The government launched the report saying, we are gonna implement every single provisions we've put in that report. And so that's just music to our ears. It's not technically how it's working on this side of the world, but so they're implementing a lot of education provisions. So really they're boosting the education system to say, we need a workforce that is well trained. And so we'll just take those employees, those workers that are losing their jobs, and we will retrain them. In Quebec, of course, we have a system that is quite helpful, but not to that extent. And I think the vision and the suspicions comes from the protection of workers. Once they leave the workplace, the protection is less comprehensive, I would say. So there was actually a lot of power relationships, I would say, between the two. And also the fact that that employers, they form an association there in Denmark compared to here. So there are institutionalized voice that help in the definition when you want to have a definition of or a common definition of a problem. That being said, also there are some areas in Denmark where employees are not as well covered, and I guess the platform is an area where companies can use platforms to operate outside of the broader collective agreement system. And I know it's an issue, it's being discussed, and they're trying out different pilot projects to have collective agreements for platform workers. They have one for the cleaning. It's called the HILFO agreement, and it's working out. However, you know, it's not as common. So there are some people who are left out of that system as well. But in the the more traditional workplaces, such as manufacturing, because of the previous institutional settings that are still there, then they're able to grasp that technological change in a much more broader way. In Quebec, the company I was studying, they were using different ways. They were experimenting also to implement Industry 4.0, but in a quite different matter, because they were using internal resources within the company. So they were using the other subsidiaries, they were using other parts of the company to join and to try to experiment, to design the smart factory. They were not as much open to using other institutional resources. So it was an experimentation that was more close within the company. So I don't know if there's an issue of trust also, of, you know, opening up to other institutional resources. And and it was more local, I would say. So it was more like an organizational experimentation rather than an institutional experimentation. So I guess power relationships are really important, and the way the institutions give power to unions and workers is really important.
Thank you so much, Julie, for elaborate answer. Thank you, Sean, for your question. We had some other questions. I do sincerely apologize to Eubin, to Lucia, who had questions. We have run out of time. Michael, who's our technical facilitator, has to leave. He's got another session, is very busy, as you can imagine, for him. So I do apologize, but I do encourage Eubin, Lucia in particular, to email the presenters directly. Hopefully the presenters will nod and say yes, you know, they can be emailed to answer any kinds of questions. So that will be very helpful. So thank you all very much for attending. Michael, you're free to go, and all of us also, we're free to do, depending on time zones, we're free to do whatever we plan to do for our day. So thank you all very much, and have a good one.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all.